Thank you for joining us today, and I hope we've got lots of people. Looks like we have got a number of people already joined us today. So just by way of introduction, my name's Jen Gwyver and I'm the Exec Director of People and Culture here at the Trust. And I have absolute pleasure today in introducing the first of a number of seminars we have during the month of February for LGBT plus History Month. Massive thank you to those who are involved in organising all this, from the EDI team to the staff network and also our wonderful comms team who keep us in check with all this digital technology that we're not amazing at. So this year's theme for LGBT plus History Month is Medicine Under the Scope, which is great for the NHS, gives us lots of scope for connections in terms of our world of work, and celebrates the contributions of people from the community in the field of medicine and healthcare. So obviously that gives us loads of opportunities to showcase the work of our LGBT plus colleagues, also the services we provide to those communities and also obviously the communities we serve. So today I've got absolute pleasure in introducing Dr. Nat Thorne, who I know loads of you know is a familiar face now on the big screen. Not sure it's their favourite thing to do, but it's always very enjoyable and also really, really interesting. And Nat's going to talk to you all about the implications around the menopause for people who don't, people from the LGBT plus community. The menopause has such a bigger media presence at the moment. I know internally we now have a menopause policy. If you think back 5 years ago, there's no way an NHS trust would have had a menopause policy. But the focus is really around a heteronormative view of cis women. And there's a real assumption out there, isn't there, that every person who experiences the menopause is heterosexual. And so Nat's going to talk to us about how the LGBT plus community is affected by the menopause, raise some questions about what we should be asking, what we should be thinking about, and generally start a conversation, I hope. I'm really sad that I can't stay for the whole session. I've just run out of the executive team meeting next door. So I'm going to be slightly naughty and stay for a few minutes, if I'm honest. Take a bit of a breather and then go back in 5 or 10 minutes, if that's okay. So hand over to Nat.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that introduction. And yeah, I know you're very busy at the moment, so thank you so much for joining us. Excellent. And thanks everyone here for joining us. And like we say, this is a subject which is quite often overlooked, I think, and one which certainly researchers like me are perhaps trying to bring a bit more attention to. So it's great to be offered a platform like this to be able to actually talk about this subject. So let's start a bit with about me. I'm sure a lot of you I've either met before or you've seen me on screen, as you say. But if you haven't met me, I'm Dr. Nat Thorne, stood looking rather freaked out by the size of balloons my friends got me after I did my Viva. They were sat in my office for ages and they were sat behind me and they just gently rustle every now and then, and it was the scariest thing. But yeah, so I am the Education, Evaluation and Research Associate at the Nottingham Centre for Transgender Health, which we probably know more as Broadway, and the clinic there. I'm also, outside of that role, I'm the chair of Notts Trans Hub, which is a support organisation for trans people locally. I'm the co-chair of the Nottinghamshire NHS Healthcare Foundation, which is basically our own LGBT network. I'm the co-chair of that. So I've got a bit of a background experience of being trans and also working in this area. I'm not actually originally from here, originally from Oxford, hence why this bit of my job title is always very important to me. That's an Oxford comma. I don't care about any other grammar, but for some reason I'm very picky about that. So there you go. You know a little bit about me now. There is a disclaimer, obviously. First of all, I'm not that sort of doctor. Even though I'm talking here about some medical stuff, it is going to be quite simplistic because I'm not a medical doctor. I'm actually an academic doctor. Oh, are these actually progressing on the actual thing, or is that just on my screen? Can people see the slides progressing? Yeah, you can. Yeah. That's fine. Excellent. Sorry, the screen in here is just on the beginning one, so but that's fine. So yeah, so I'm not that sort of doctor. So obviously the medical bits will be you know, quite simplistic. But I am a researcher in this area as well. I'm also a stakeholder in this research. I'm older than I look. I am non-binary. I am 46 this year, so you know that kind of puts me in the area for this. And I've also done lots of work with something called the Queer Menopause Collective, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But we are hoping to take some work forward within the clinic I work in to look at the menopause, particularly in relation to trans people, although today I'll be opening that up much wider because obviously it's LGBT plus History Month. So what we're going to cover, well, first of all, look a little bit at the history of the menopause, such history as there is. We're going to have a bit about what the menopause is, just so we're all working with the same terminology and we can kind of understand it a bit. And then the last bit is I want to go really into depth about how each of these letters that we have in the LGBTQIA, how all of those are affected by the menopause, because it might be easy to think, well, it's only lesbians that are affected by it, you know, it's not trans guys and things, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into that to show that actually it is something which affects a lot of the queer community. So first of all, bit of background. The word menopause, it always seems weird that it starts with men, but meno, meaning men, month, it's actually ancient Greek. So it's related to obviously, you know, menstruation means, you know, every month. Pause means pause. Although obviously we are actually talking more of a stop here than a pause. So menopause, that's actually where the word comes from. It's not actually from ancient Greece, I'd like to point out. It wasn't a term that came around back in the day there. It's just that, like many words in medicine, it is related to something Greek, which is normally either Greek or Latin, to be honest, isn't it? But this is actually the fellow that probably created this word, this jolly-looking fella. This is Sir Charles Negre. He's a French doctor, but he also did an awful lot of research. I think he's around about the Victorian era. So he was, first of all, he was the first person who actually linked menstruation to the idea that, you know, people who menstruate quite often have a womb. It's amazing that it took that long, but that was one of his big discoveries. But he also was the first person who really linked perimenopausal symptoms to it. Now, like I say, we'll talk about the difference between perimenopause and menopause in a bit, but the symptoms we all kind of have a bit of an understanding about. He was the first person to really look into that. So the likelihood is that he invented that word, menopause. He obviously needed a haircut as well. Every photo I've ever seen of him, I don't think it's the fashion at the time. I just think that he probably didn't have a haircut because it's all kind of spinned around his head. Not the point. So it's pretty amazing that it was 1821 when this link was first discovered between the physical womb and menopause, but it actually took 100 years for doctors to actually then realise that hormones were involved as well. So there was kind of no rush to build on his previous work. It was stuff that he sort of created, and people was like, well, that's interesting, but doctors didn't take it forward very much. So it's something you'll see in this history bit. There's a little bit of a lag in things happening and then being responded to. And we will touch on that in a minute. So talking about long delay, 1970s was the first time that treatments were available in the form of HRT. Now, bearing in mind, like we've got there, the first time menopausal symptoms have been actually mentioned in recorded literature was all the way back to Aristotle. So saying that there wasn't a rush, that was 2,000 years ago that symptoms of menopause were first mentioned, and it took all the way to 1970 to be able to go to the GP and get some treatment. So obviously, yeah, there's something going on there. It's clearly there's been a delay in finding out about menopause. So why is this? Why has there been so little research up until the last century and this century? I mean, I say one thing, lifespans were much shorter. Ultimately, if you're talking about the most people living to the age of 34 on average, then not many people actually live long enough to be able to display these symptoms. So the people who generally lived old enough to have symptoms were probably quite, without using the word posh, quite posh. People who were able to pay for medical treatment to keep themselves alive longer. And therefore, there was kind of perhaps a little bit of class coming in here, that it's absolutely fine to be perhaps go through this period of being perhaps a bit angry, perhaps having a bit of a weird phase with your personality if you had a lot of money. So for that reason, it wasn't something that was really looked at a lot. And to be honest, a lot of people who were perhaps quite poor and did live to that age and did perhaps experience some extreme symptoms, a lot of people were actually put in asylums for that, and there was some very poor treatment of those people. So there's quite a lot of mixture of class and things going on there. The other thing is, in order to understand the menopause, the researchers had to get the basics right. They had to actually do research on menstruation and hormones, and that was also lacking. So you can't move on to then talking about the menopause if you haven't got these basics sorted out. It's an unknown unknown. There's no way of knowing that this is linked to hormones and menstruation if you haven't already found out what those are. So obviously there was quite a lack of research in the area, but there is one massive factor why there was a lack of research in this area, and that is, of course, sexism. The vast majority of people doing research up to 100 years ago even were male assigned at birth, and that does lead certain conditions to perhaps have more research around them. And ultimately, with menstruation and the menopause, there still is that kind of look factor that prevails. People who just, men don't particularly want to talk about women's stuff and things like that. So this unfortunately has led to this kind of slow reveal of the menopause and the science behind it. And it is unfortunate, but as we know, people like Davina McCall and Claudia Winkleman, Carol Vorderman, it is now starting to be pushed much more into the spotlight. And that's a really good thing, because ultimately we are fighting against this history of not much research in this area. So if we talk about what it actually is, this makes it look like a really nice, neat kind of process. It's obviously not as neat as this, but technically speaking, obviously you peak, if you're assigned female at birth, you'll peak with your estrogen sort of around about that age 35. And then according to this nice, neat diagram, you'll have that kind of reduction in estrogen until you only have estrogen in your feet, according to this. But you know what I mean? You end up with a sort of quite a low level of estrogen. Now, the thing is, this time when it's actually reducing down between the ages about 50 and 60, it isn't that nice, neat sort of line you'd see on a graph. It's much more like this. The same as estrogen levels would normally vary during menstruation. It just goes completely balmy during menopause time, and it's more like a sort of up and down thing. But on the whole, there is that kind of slide downwards. So that's kind of literally the basics of it, which is really easy to understand. It's just, estrogen is slowly slipping away, and you're having your last ovulations, because obviously there's the last few eggs there to be fertilized. So that's basically what we're talking about. Now, the stages, obviously pre-menopause, that's, people who have been menstruating for many years and they're perhaps 35, 30, 40, nothing much is happening. Obviously, we'll say younger people can go through an early menopause, but generally speaking, most people will be in that state for quite a few years. Now, perimenopause, this is probably about my age and upwards. This is sort of, I think they describe it about 45 to 55. it's where things really start to get rocky with that estrogen levels, where they're going up and down and up and down, and the, you know, the line of best fit would be going like that. So it's kind of this phase. Now, for some people, it's normally about 4 years. For some people, it can be even longer. Some people can be 10 years. And I've heard some people tell me that they feel as though they've been through it for about 11 or 12 years. So the actual menopause is when you've had 12 consecutive months without any ovulation. So no periods for 12 months. The average age is 51. And that's when you are leading into the post-menopause, which is where everything settles down and you obviously don't menstruate anymore. So those are kind of the, very crudely, the 4 different stages of the menopause. So quite often we use menopause as a catch-all term, but quite often when we're talking about certain symptoms, we're actually talking about perimenopause. I think this term is getting much more known and much more used these days. So these are American numbers, so I can't, you know, obviously I couldn't find any for the UK that are this accurate, but to give you sort of an idea, 51 is about the average age that periods end. And in the US at the moment, there's about 50 million people who are currently in menopause. Obviously, that's going to be smaller for the UK. But if you think about the amount of people we have in that age bracket, particularly the perimenopause age bracket, it's actually quite a lot of people. And because it can last 8 to 10 to 11 years, that does actually mean that there's quite a lot of people going through this at the moment, which ultimately leads to the conclusion that it can't only be straight heterosexual cis people going through this. There has to be quite a number of queer people going through this as well. So I'm not going to go through all of the list because it's a fantastically long list. I can just tell you this list has been very useful to me in the last sort of year or so. Something has happened and I've checked the list and gone, oh, all right, okay, that's probably that. But there is a lot of symptoms of perimenopause. The list can be even a bit longer than this because it can interact with things such as ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions, and other conditions as well. It can definitely interact with those. So it's quite an extensive list. And yeah, it basically that fluctuation in estrogen really plays havoc with a lot of the body. So this is why we have this special focus now on this period of time, because it can impact somebody really massively. For a lot of us, it will just be annoying things that happen, difficult things that happen, but it can go all the way up to really some serious impact happening on people's lives. And that is why we have a menopause policy now, because ultimately this can affect you at work as well. So I'm just going to have a word about the andropause. It's very unusefully been labelled the male menopause. It's not at all. It's nothing like the menopause, I'm afraid, guys out there. It's a much more gentle decline. So the andropause is not really a period of time like the menopause either. It's this gradual decline in testosterone. It's generally only about 2% per year. So that's not really enough to have the same impacts that the menopause does, because ultimately that's going up and down all the time. But sometimes men who are in this kind of age bracket, the sort of, the 45, 50, 60-year-old, if they have something called hypogonadism, that then might bring on some similar symptoms as the menopause. However, that is a condition you would go to your GP for and you would get some testosterone treatment for. So it's not the same as menopause. It is part of aging. Now, ultimately, this can still affect men. Clearly, the growing older process, particularly in this society, can affect you mentally. It can affect you physically. But just to put it out there, that actually is not the same thing we're talking about when we're talking about the menopause. It's just the bad end of the stick, unfortunately, aside female people get, is that you do have that period with these vastly fluctuating hormones rather than that nice kind of slow 2% decline. So getting on to this thing, man. why is it more difficult for our, the community that we're celebrating this month and we're marking this month? So I'm going to go through pretty much all of the letters in our nice little alphabet soup there, just to kind of explain the impact it can have on all of these. This is based on several things. This is based on some literature reviews I did recently to put together a grant to hope to do some more research in this area. It's put upon a lot of the knowledge that was gained by the Queer Menopause Project, where we discussed a lot of this with the queer community. Some of it is based on my own observations from people around me as well. Some of it's kind of based on common sense as well, and things you probably wouldn't have thought about. So we'll start with L for lesbian. So first of all, the thing that we found when we were looking both at the grey literature and also at the opinions of people who identified as lesbians is that the advice on sex-related issues was very heterosexual. Without getting too much into sort of detail, it was very focused on penetration and issues with that. It didn't talk as much about lower sex drive and how you handle that when there's two people perhaps going through lower sex drive at the same time. And also, obviously, there's this linking of menstruation to fertility, and it is not saying that obviously that lesbians aren't interested in fertility. In fact, completely the opposite is that a lot of the advice leaflets that were about fertility had the typical, man and woman wanting to produce a child. They didn't, for example, have representations of lesbians in that. So there's kind of a sense of older lesbians feeling a little bit invisible in that literature. I'm not really feeling like it was aimed towards them, or that there was an expectation, why would they be trying for a baby anyway, let alone when they're later in life. But I think this is probably the major thing about lesbians and the menopause. It's the double menopause. Unless you have quite a significant age gap between both people in the relationship, or somebody for some reason has had early menopause, the chances are in that household you might have two people going through the menopause at the same time. Now, both my partner and I were assigned female at birth, so I can definitely speak from experience on this. It can sometimes be tricky to negotiate that, because ultimately your emotions can be affected, the way you react to things can be affected, obviously physically you may be affected. So negotiating the menopause in a relationship for lesbians can be significantly different, because you have basically two firing off at once, and it can make it much harder to negotiate. And again, we didn't really see much advice about this in the literature. It was something that was just not mentioned anywhere that we could find. So shifting across to gay men, again, we're talking now not obviously necessarily about the menopause. If we think for a moment about that andropause and how we said it's not actually that salient for men assigned at birth, we do still remember that it's part of an aging process. Now, whether it's right or wrongly, and whatever you agree or disagree, the gay scene can still be quite oriented around looks, and obviously it can be quite oriented around sex. And for a lot of gay men, it can be quite tricky to have things such as hair loss. Ultimately, your skin changes, your virility changes, your sex drive changes as you get that lower testosterone. So this can actually have an emotional state. So saying that the andropause is completely different, while that is true, there's still an effect of it that can happen. And also there is that issue of men in society, masculine people in society, are not really brought up to be very talky about the feelings. Again, there's a lot of work going on in this area to try and get men to open up more. But actually, if aging is something which might well have an effect on a lot of men, and being able to talk about it can actually be quite difficult, because there's kind of this feeling that you might be trying to not acknowledge it, because then you'll kind of, draw attention to it. So ultimately, gay men are not immune to that. If they're assigned male at birth and grew up as male, it might be they find it hard to talk about the changes happening to them too. And also, Don't forget that not every gay man was assigned male at birth. There's a lot of trans guys who identify as gay males, even though they take a high level of testosterone. Generally speaking, it looks as though that will at least negate a lot of the symptoms. But there have been a few case studies of trans men who are taking testosterone who haven't had a hysterectomy and who are still experiencing some of those symptoms to a greater or lesser degree. So the assumption that everybody who goes through the menopause was assigned female, is living as a female or living as non-binary is not necessarily the case. There are some trans men who are also experiencing this. And obviously, of course, there are trans men who, for various reasons, can't take testosterone or can't have a hysterectomy. There's that assumption every trans guy will have every treatment under the sun. That's not necessarily true for a lot of trans men. So, and a lot of trans men come out late in life and are on those waiting lists to be able to get testosterone treatment and to be able to get hysterectomies. So we want to get away from that assumption that every gay man is not going to experience the menopause or not going to experience some effect from the changes in their hormones. So T is for transgender. Now, this is obviously I've put what the acronym is here because it's quite confusing, but I couldn't fit all of the words in. So when we talk about somebody assigned female at birth, that's a trans person like me, who's non-binary or maybe a trans man or a trans masculine person. When we talk about an assigned male at birth, we're talking about somebody who is trans feminine or a trans woman. Okay, so someone who's assigned female will have more than likely been born with a uterus and will have experienced, menstruation. So that's the way around those two acronyms are. So obviously, like I said before, people who are assigned female at birth, who for any reason are not taking testosterone or have not had a hysterectomy, that's me included. I think a lot of non-binary people will be in this group. Obviously, you have to remember that that means that we are still not present in that literature. You know, we tend to have female and woman as the main descriptor in a lot of the material that's out there at the moment. But obviously, there's non-binary people, and there are some people who identify as male, like I say, who are either waiting for treatment or haven't had it. So trans people, we do experience the menopause, most definitely. I live in a 100% trans house with my partner, and we are definitely 100% trans people going through the menopause. It definitely happens. There's some people who do take testosterone still go through it as well. There's always been that assumption that if you take any testosterone, it will wipe all of those symptoms out. Well, it's quite new these days, but a lot of people do like to microdose on testosterone. They like to maybe either ease themselves into it, or they perhaps just want a low level of testosterone to lower the voice and to have a few of the different changes. And there's some evidence to suggest that that actually people on low level of T will still experience a few of the symptoms. Now, when it comes to people assigned male at birth, ultimately they won't experience a menopause as we know it. Trans women, and it's something which actually, for some trans women, it's actually quite upsetting to them as well, that they're not experiencing what's going on around them. Because every trans woman their age, every cis woman their age they're interacting with is talking about menopause, and they're talking about the symptoms and things like that. And it's a conversation that they can't really get involved in. That doesn't mean, though, that they've never experienced similar symptoms to the menopause. If somebody who's assigned male at birth is taking estrogen and they suddenly stop for some reason, they will experience some of those. They will experience some of those withdrawal symptoms. Trans women are advised to stop taking estrogen before surgery, and I've known a lot of trans women in my life who said they'd started to get hot flushes, they started to get brain fog, and they had that same kind of feeling of that low level of estrogen. But I think mostly it's this feeling of dysphoria that trans women don't go through it. And I think after menopause, I think trans women are fine and they feel much better about it, because ultimately some of the changes that happen with cis women do sometimes the voice does get a bit lower, and obviously they sort of end up perhaps feeling as though it's fine because they still fit in with their peers, but at the time when they're going through it, there's that mismatch between what's going on in someone's life and going on in their life. So intersex. Now we are starting to know more and more about intersex conditions. Obviously, there's a whole range of different intersex conditions. One of them are when women are born with an XY chromosome and quite often have internal testes. And these are often removed at a young age, and that can actually trigger some symptoms of the menopause. So some intersex people have been through menopausal symptoms fairly early. There are some people with intersex conditions who do have a functioning uterus. And while they might want to embrace their intersex identity, it does also mean that they will be going through the menopause as well. And also, there are some people who are intersex who maybe present as male now. Maybe they feel that they're more under the trans umbrella. And ultimately, that if they have a functioning uterus, they will be going through the menopause as well. So again, it's that kind of idea of the net of people who actually go through menopause is much wider than just cis women. There's a whole range of people who do go through it. And while it's an incredibly small number, I think we shouldn't forget intersex people. And asexuals, so I mean, first of all, there's an assumption, I think, that after people go through the menopause, they become asexual. And certainly in the research we did, a lot of asexual people felt almost a bit put out by that, because it's a bit like, well, we've been asexual from the beginning. This is a very important part of our identity. It's a bit more than just not wanting to have sex, not having a sex drive. And so I think that there's that assumption that we all end up asexual, and that's not necessarily true. This is something which is an identity for somebody. I think there's also assumption among some people. We had a few people say that their family assumed they wouldn't go through the menopause because their asexuality is caused by a lack of hormones anyway. Now, that's not the case. Asexual people do still go through the menopause. And I think this was the most important thing we found when we were asking the community, is that lots of the literature out there, when you're talking about relationships, it really focuses on sex and on those issues of sex drive and vaginal dryness and things like that. There wasn't actually much of the literature which talks about how it affected you romantically, and certainly how those mood swings and those difficulties can affect you in a more sort of relationship partnership capacity. So that was definitely vastly missing from the material as well. But there's one big issue, I think, that overrides everything, and I've already kind of mentioned it before, and it is literally this, is that the menopause is assumed to be straight and cis. Nowadays, we are starting to see more inclusion of LGBT people, but as you've seen from those slides, actually there's a very special nuance for each of these individual groups. And those nuances are talked about in the community with each other, but there's no research out there, or certainly very little research out there. And the grey literature is definitely missing as well. So the issues then, we've talked about language. Now, one of the problems we come across with this is this idea of erasure of women by opening this category up to include other people. The gold standard is quite simply, we can say women and those who experience symptoms, but it is really important to use words beyond just woman when talking about menopause and perimenopause, because as we've seen, there's actually quite a large number of people who don't fit into that word, who are actually experiencing these symptoms. And it is really off-putting. And I can tell you from somebody who has actually been looking around at a lot of the literature, it is really off-putting to feel as though you're not included. It does make you feel as though you're going through your menopause on your own, because ultimately you're not in the same group that people are talking about. But also, it seems as though getting help can be a lot harder. particularly if you're assigned female at birth and you feel like any level of testosterone would help. It's really hard to get testosterone for the menopause anyway, I gather, but it seems like if you are in any way trans, that makes it even more difficult. But even other things like these assumptions that are made about trans people, they're carried over into the GP surgeries quite a lot. We had a lot of people talking about how GPs were saying, well, I'm not sure if I can treat you because I don't know how these, I don't know how to do HRT on somebody who's already on low level testosterone and things. And that's obviously something that research is going to really help. But also they found that things like GPs were automatically using she and her for them, even though they'd said my pronouns are different. But as soon as you talk about the menopause, there was this kind of idea that you now need to use female pronouns for this person. And that was very disturbing to a lot of people. Some other issue is that the group we're talking about, obviously through history, the LGBT, goodness knows with LGBT History Month, we know this, but as a group, we've very much had a lot of prejudice forced our way. We still do, some members of the LGBTQI community more than others, but that does have an impact on mental health. Various studies over and over again have shown that this group has a higher level of anxiety and depression and everything that follows on from that, non-suicidal self-injury, for example. Certainly within the trans community, there's a lot more ADHD and a lot more neurodiversity. And a lot of these issues can be, they can be made a lot worse by the menopause. I mean, I've got ADHD myself, and I can definitely tell you that going through perimenopause makes brain fog 10 times worse if you already are living with brain fog. So that's another issue, which again is not necessarily discussed much in the literature. But I think also, lastly, bringing it back to being trans, for some people it can be really hard to talk about. You don't really, particularly if you're trans masculine, you don't want to draw attention to the fact that your body has a uterus or that you have been through menstruation. For a lot of us, that brings about a lot of dysphoria, and it also doesn't help with things such as reinforcing your pronoun. If you're talking in the same way about menopause, it does make people perhaps forget that you're non-binary or that you're a trans man. And so that can make it really hard to talk about. And I also find it hard to talk about because there is that feeling that it's a very feminine thing to go through. It's a very female thing to go through. And that can make it very hard to claim for yourself. You tend to perhaps want to ignore it and not talk about it and just go, well, this is something I'll deal with on my own, and not sort of talk about. And unfortunately, that does mean that obviously quite often you're suffering in silence. And so these are all issues which the LGBTQI community are facing on quite a daily basis. So what can you do? What can you do? What can you do? I mean, I've put my teeth in properly. What can you do? People who don't menstruate, people who have not, I'm mainly talking about cis guys here, I guess, but also other people who are not likely to go through menopause. Do stop making jokes about it. It's not really that funny for a lot of people. And I know that quite often we talk about menopausal moments and things like that, but sometimes there's a level, and quite often I've heard the level being crossed by a lot of people. So perhaps being a bit more sensitive would be good, and to have an awareness that this is happening and not dismiss it. I think we're getting to the stage now where we've realised this is a bit more serious biscuits than we thought, and we can't just go, oh, she's just of that age, or like, yeah, having a moment, love, and things like that. And I think we're moving a much more beyond that, but I think having some sensitivity is really important. People who do menstruate, if you're under the age of 45, I think it's worth thinking about what you can do now. Things like giving up smoking, obviously, keeping your weight in check and doing lots of exercise and stuff as well. But also, I think if you're part of this community, part of the LGBT plus community, it's worthwhile trying to find now the literature that you can find on this. Like I say, there's not a lot out there, and we are trying to produce more as researchers, but it's worthwhile taking a look at what's out there anyway. And I would say for everybody, and I know I've said this before, and I will say it again, just don't make an assumption that just because somebody doesn't identify as female, they're not going through the menopause. Somebody may well be, you know, to all intents, a guy, they may still be going through the menopause. Let's not make that assumption that it's only women that go through this. A lot of other people do as well. So my voice is almost on the way out, I think. But I just want to spend some time to open it up for questions. If anyone has any comments that they'd like to add, and I don't know if there's anything been put in the chat as well that we wanted to ask. No. So is there anyone who has any questions out there? Let me stop sharing my screen. I see no hands raised. No, if no one has something to ask, then you can have 20 minutes of your lunch break back. Okay, excellent. Well, that's it. Thanks so much for listening. And I hope you're all going to look forward to the next talk, which I believe is on the 21st, and that's all about being bisexual. So again, that will be shared on Teams as well. So thanks everybody for listening. There's a question. Oh, there's a question already. How is it best to deal with people getting the terminology wrong? Well, sensitively. I think ultimately it might be best just to present people with the facts and just say, well, we ought to make sure that we say women and people experiencing the menopause, just because there are people who don't identify as women. I think it's always sensitivity with these issues. I think people don't respond very well if you take quite a hard line on it. I think it's the way that you put it across. So when I'm trying to correct somebody, I'll always try to do it politely and say, I wonder if it's an idea if we do this, or, you know, I think we probably should do this. And I know that sometimes there can be some kickback about that. But it really is great if people do make that effort to try and correct people on their language, because ultimately trans people like me, we're not always in the room at the time that this language is being used or decided on. So if people can be a big advocate for that, then that would be awesome. I hope that answers your question.
We've got one more.
One more, yeah.
Why don't GP look at the bigger picture rather than treating individual symptoms?
So that's interesting. Well, that I can't really answer because I'm not a GP. So I would say that I think the trouble is that from my own personal experience is that tends to be what we give GPs. We tend to go in and say, I'm having this particular problem, and then, you know, that's the way it's dealt with. Certainly with trans people, it can be very difficult to treat holistically unless you have that knowledge about trans bodies. And one thing that's really desperately missing from training, I think, for a lot of medical health professionals is training on trans bodies, because we are different sometimes because we've had treatment. And I think that's some extra training that's needed. But yeah, it's a difficult one to answer, not actually being a GP myself, but I'd say that that's one of the issues is we do go in with particular symptoms that we want to end.
The last question, I have a few points to say, really good presentation.
Oh, thank you. That's great. Yeah, my voice has been terrible today. I'm sorry about that, but I've got my sinuses always going crazy when the weather changes, but I've still got a little bit left. Cool. Excellent.
I think that's it.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everybody.